Hey everyone, welcome to the Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt. And if you know me, you know that I'm a big fan of open source resources and tools. And when the tool that we're going to be talking about today came my way, I was just impressed with how it came together and I wanted to learn more. And so I'm really excited today to be joined by Dianna Langenburg. She is the VP for Talent and Human Resources at the WK Kellogg Foundation, as well as Debbie Green. She is the Director of Talent Development and DEI. And I'll include a link to the resources in the show notes for the podcast. But they recently open sourced an HR toolkit for racial equity. And we're going to spend some time learning more about it, how it came together, and how practitioners out there can use it. So Dianna, Debbie, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Dianna, I'd love to open with you. If you wanted to start with an introduction for the audience, and how would you like them to know you?
Great. Thanks, Lars. First, I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk. What an amazing platform that you've created, not only this Future of Work series, but also your vision for HR open source, employer branding, and so forth. So you can count Debbie and I among your fans. I am Dianna Langenburg, and I am a mom to my beautiful daughter, Lindsay, and son-in-law, Mark, and my two wonderful granddogs who live in Rhode Island. I was born and raised in Michigan with a short stint in Texas as well. And I joined the Kellogg Foundation 30 years ago, and it feels like a walk in the park. And I would like to share a little bit around my why for this work and my learnings over the years. I joined the foundation in the early 90s. I did not know anything about white privilege or my place. I had not heard of it. And I spent most of my career kind of unlearning a lot of the paradigms that I learned growing up. And it has been such an opportunity. I've apprenticed most every role that I've had. And it has been a journey every day. And I'm just delighted to talk about not only my personal journey, but what we've learned at the Kellogg Foundation expressed in this toolkit and beyond. Debbie and I have worked together for 30 years, and we can finish each other's sentences. She's been deployed to this project for the last three years or so, and I'll turn it to Debbie to talk about that next and introduce herself.
Thanks, Dianna. Hi, I'm Debbie Green, and I have been with the foundation for 34 years and have been in talent and human resources for that entire time period. So I've seen HR move from more the personnel, transactional team to one that's really involved with all aspects of our organizational journey. And as Dianna said, we've worked together on the foundation's journey, and we do work on racial equity both internally as well as externally through our program efforts. And when I know when I first started on my own journey, and we're two white women. And so we both have had a long journey going from not really knowing or understanding anything about racial equity to now being immersed in that work and helping share our story with others. So as Dianna said, we're thrilled to be here.
Yeah, one thing I appreciate about kind of how both you commented on this work is that you started this work with your own education and your own learning and Dianna, to your point, unlearning, because I think that's such an important part for practitioners. And again, the field of HR in the United States, at least, is 67% white. And so this work is really, we are the foundation to this work. And it starts with self-education so that we can understand a lot of the concepts that you expand on in the toolkit itself. So I just appreciate that kind of opening and framing. I imagine, many the listeners and amplifiers out there are, familiar with the WK Kellogg Corporation, but perhaps not the foundation. And so I would love to just, Dianna, if you could take a minute, just give us an overview of the foundation with a bit of kind of contextual understanding in terms of like rough numbers, headcount, locations, things like that, just to help the audience kind of frame the environment you're both working in.
Sure, thanks. We were founded by breakfast and cereal innovator and entrepreneur Will Keith Kellogg in 1930. And our Kellogg Foundation is dedicated to supporting thriving children, working families, and equitable communities. We are about 220 employees, and we have offices in Michigan, headquartered in Battle Creek, Michigan, also in Detroit and Grand Rapids, Michigan. Jackson, Mississippi, Albuquerque, New Mexico, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Chiapas in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, as well as Central and South Haiti. We have a deep, everything that we do embedded within all of the foundation's work is a commitment to advancing racial equity and racial healing, developing our leaders and engaging communities in solving their own problems. We support the work throughout the U.S. and with our sovereign tribes in Mexico and Haiti. So a bit about the Kellogg Foundation there. And you were speaking a moment ago about learning and unlearning, and racial healing is such an important part of the Kellogg Foundation's work in that regard.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to jump right into the toolkit. And perhaps we can start, obviously, it sounds like, the organization and the foundation has been committed to this work. And as a foundation committed to this work, like there's certain things that you will do internally, there's certain things that you will do externally. And I think a lot of companies, from an internal perspective, um, the programs, the initiatives that they lead tend to be, obviously they're for an internal audience, they're tied to internal objectives and goals. But we don't often see these types of initiatives open sourced publicly and externally. And so I'd love to just spend a minute, really kind of open this up to both of you on the origin story of the toolkit itself, particularly kind of how it came to be and what the process was for deciding, hey, you know what, this is something that we should make public for all practitioners to benefit from.
Yeah, the HR toolkit really it's a summary of the tools that we've developed and used, the lessons that we've learned, and how we've learned those lessons. And it's been a decades-long journey for us internally. And over the years, we've had many organizations contact us to find out, how did you do it? So we have a one publication journey that this toolkit complements. So our one publication is the broader story of the foundation's racial equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts, but it's more the high level. It wasn't really the how-to. So we said, well, we're willing to share all of these resources that we've created and that have helped us along our journey. And so we were getting these requests and trying to send things piecemeal. And it's been our dream for a number of years to be able to say, here's a nice little package that we can share with you that tells our whole story and all the tools that we've used, so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's really how we ended up with this toolkit as a practical how-to guide for organizations to use in multiple areas of HR function.
Yeah, I'm curious, from a timing perspective, you mentioned this is something that's kind of been coming together for a decade. Why now? Was there a kind of intentionality around releasing the toolkit kind of in this moment in time?
I don't think our timing was intentional. I know there's a lot of things going on right now with, the affirmative action decision coming down, and a lot of organizations had ramped up their DEI efforts after George Floyd. So it's been in the news a lot, and I know that it's been top of mind for a lot of HR folks. We see the racial equity as a journey, right? It's not a point in time. There's no silver bullet. It is a journey. And so I think that's what we're trying to reinforce through this toolkit, is that there's always something you can do. There's always an area of HR that you can choose to focus on. There's no perfect place to start. It's interesting. We were having a conversation the other day with a corporate DEI leader, and one of the things he said was, the best way to start your DEI journey is to start your DEI journey. So every organization has to figure that out. Where is the right place to start? Do you start with one initiative? Do you try to implement multiple initiatives at any given time? So every organization has to take these tools and these resources and figure out what's the best way for them to move forward. And hopefully these tools will help them do that.
Yeah, and I'm curious, Diana, are there particular, like when you look across the toolkit itself, and perhaps you look internally, either within the programs that have been most impactful at the foundation or impactful in the companies that you've worked with, but obviously for companies that are truly committed to this work, impact is such an important driver of where and how they invest their time and their budget. And so, in a world, particularly mentioned kind of coming after the murder of George Floyd, where I think a lot of companies did a lot of optical work in this space and performative work in this space, but they weren't necessarily really focused on how will this actually have an impact in the organization. It was more of how do we tell the world that we're doing
Yeah.
something, and so those efforts obviously fell flat. So, everything kind of coming back to impact. When you think about the toolkit or practices that you've seen be successful, what do those tend to be? What stands out to you?
It's interesting the definition of success itself, right? And so part of this process is trying, experiencing, failing, learning, reflecting. And so we share about our failures as much as we share about our successes because we think what one size doesn't fit all, and it's different for everyone, both individually and by organization. And so for the Kellogg Foundation, we started on the inside. We started programming externally for decades ahead, programming with racial equity and equity in mind. And we started then with hiring internally, and we increased our staff representation. Our philosophy and values indicate that we want to reflect the communities in which we serve. And so we recognized tremendous growth over time in both diverse workforce representation as well as our board of trustees. And from there, looked at development and awareness, and we had lots of learnings there. We can break that down and talk about it. I think one of the most successful things that we did to hold ourselves accountable was to embed racial equity into our performance management system. And so by having every employee be responsible for a learning goal, and then as we got more into it, an application of learning to their work and to their job, we spent a lot of time talking about that way, embedding it across the entire organization.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like, how did the toolkit itself come to be in terms of the constituents that are involved in developing the toolkit and the guide themselves? Like, how did you tap into underrepresented employees and populations within the foundation to ensure that those perspectives were reflected in the output of the work?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lars. And one of the things that we use at the foundation is human-centered design principles. And so one example of that from the toolkit, one of the very first examples is around developing standards, principles, and approaches for our racial equity work. And we said, we can't just come down from on high and say, this is what it's going to be. We knew that we were going to have to work with our staff, involve them in creating those standards. And once we had all of their feedback, then we shared it back with employees to say, does this sound right to you? Does this feel right to you? Before we implemented anything. And that's the approach that we try to take to all the work that we do, because we know that you can't just say it and it's going to be. Employees really have to be invested in it, and it has to be something that works for everyone, and that everyone feels like they've had a voice in creating those. So we've done that, I think, in almost every tool that we've created, both with our internal staff as well as our external partners as well.
Yeah. And of course, and Diana, maybe you have a perspective on this, but this work, the success or lack thereof in some cases of this work, often ties back to leadership, adoption, role modeling, support. Um, how do you recommend? I mean, if there's HR practitioners out there that maybe they're watching this conversation, perhaps they're a CPO, perhaps they're a manager, but they're just passionate about this work, and they really want to ensure that their leadership team is, supportive and understands their role in making this successful. Do you have any advice for leaders there that are really trying to get their leadership team to support the journey of this work? Because I do also like that you called out that this is a journey. Like the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging isn't, you never get there. It's never, you're never complete. You're never done. It is something that you need to be committed to for the long haul. And you're continuing to learn and iterate and refine and make mistakes and learn from them and move forward. So knowing that this is kind of an ongoing commitment with no finish line, how can we get leaders within our organizations supportive of these
Yeah,
initiatives?
that's a great question, Lars. And one of the tools that the Kellogg Foundation has developed is the uh, business case for racial equity, and it's performed across the country in different locations. And so this work is for everyone, whether it's board or leadership or staff. And so creating that authorizing environment is really important to make sure you have that support. And we do that through uh, holding up holding up truth to our leadership team and sharing examples of where it is holding us back. And we collect data from our staff, and we talk around what that means. We were just in a meeting the other day, and we were hearing themes about the team that sounded to me like a white dominant male culture, or U.S. corporate culture, as you were, and really calling that and talking, what does that look like? It looks like overly strict deadlines or perfectionism, or what else, Debbie?
Worship of the written word. Um, there's all kinds of ways that white dominant culture shows up in organizations, and I think we just have to keep our minds open to looking at that and being willing to look at that, to say, how is this impacting people of color within our organization? Because it could be something that we don't even realize it. Because we're like fish swimming in water. We don't realize the impact that the culture is having on people. And so just I think my advice would be for organizations to have an open mind about that, to talk about it intentionally, and to say, how can we make changes so that everybody in our organization can thrive?
One other thing that we do with our leadership team is to hold up the data, and it's with regard to every talent decision that we make. So it's, who are we hiring, who are we promoting, who is getting recognition, what's our turnover like, and when we see patterns and trends that are higher than expected for persons of color, we talk about that now, and that's been kind of embedded in the fabric of how we do work now. Super important and a great way to sell to your leaders what's really happening.
Yeah, I mean that the data is so important, and I think it's interesting. We when you're doing this work, and I do realize that we're holding this conversation as three white people with all the privilege that comes with that, and so I feel like it would, I have to acknowledge that for a moment. But I think it is important because this comment I'm about to make is also for our white audience who are watching and listening right now. And I think what's really important is the terminology and the verbiage of this work, the terms that we use, the words that we use, they really, they do matter. And if we can take, I think in the current discourse, especially in the United States, where everybody is so polarized, and we'll get into the Supreme Court ruling in a moment, but we're in an environment where this notion of privilege, or white fragility, or terms like that, I think some people who are not doing this work, they bristle when they hear that, and they bristle because they don't understand the word, they don't understand the definition of what it really means, and they're so in their mind it's a loaded term that is used to diminish them, when that's not actually what it is if you spend the time to really understand it. And so I appreciate you framing, having the open mind to be able to really kind of understand. And like when people meet resistance, right? And again, there's lots of resistance to DEIB programs, obviously the Supreme Court ruling, some of the recent legislation in Florida, in Texas, clearly, diminishing some of the rights and even trying to rewrite history a bit. How do you recommend kind of overcoming that, right? So when you're trying to roll out programs, let's say you're trying to, you have this toolkit in your hand and you're trying to implement some of these programs, and you may get directors, VPs, even officers pushing back for some of those reasons. How do you tend to coach, not just HR leaders, but leaders in general in kind of overcoming some of that, just, legacy perhaps mindset or lack of openness to understanding things from a different perspective?
Couple of tools come to mind, Lars. One that we have used extensively is the IDI, or Intercultural Development Inventory. And everyone at the foundation takes that upon joining the foundation, including our board of trustees. And it's a tool to measure cultural competency. And you're assigned a coach that reviews the results with you confidentially. And part of our way of operating also is that we accept everyone where they are. We're all along our journeys. It is personal, it is independent, but it's also collective. And we looked at that collectively for the Kellogg Foundation and learned that we were in this phase where we were denying difference. And if you were raised like I was, it was we don't see color. It's not rude. It's rude to talk about that. Shush. And so really overcoming those paradigms that folks grew up with without shaming them is an important part. Another part of acknowledging everyone who's in the room is healing circles. And we've done that internally, externally with my peers in philanthropy and HR, in conferences, so it can be used anywhere. And what listening circles and healing circles are about are really acknowledging another's experience at the deepest level and finding that common ground and beginning to heal and sitting with it. And for white people, that often means feeling uncomfortable and having some discomfort. And we have a White Action and Learning Group that does just that, to come together and talk around how might we use our privilege for good, how might we know when to use it and know when to be quiet, and that type of thing. So all kinds of opportunity there, a couple of tools that we use.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate that context. That's helpful. And again, the action orientation of the toolkit itself is one of the things that I really liked about it, because I think we will never have enough resources to support this work, and also doing it in a very kind of clear and concise way as a practitioner who maybe, at different stages, maybe even the early stages of that journey, as you mentioned, they're still gonna have a lot of takeaways from it. What has been the reaction, right? It's been released. It's out in the wild, as they say. What has been the response from, not just the HR community, but the business community at large?
Yeah, so it's only been out there for a couple of weeks. We're very excited that we finally released it, but so far, just in that first 2 weeks, we've had hundreds of downloads from our website. We've also had some sharing on LinkedIn, and we've received nothing but support and enthusiasm to the toolkit, and a lot of folks wanting to learn more. And we're hoping that people will also share their own stories and their tools. We're hoping it'll inspire others to do that, because every organization is different and we can all learn from each other.
Yeah. I mean, I think the timing of this being released, and not timing in terms of like it's been out for a couple of weeks, but just kind of this moment in time for HR. We've been making this long kind of journey from, um, you know, proprietary practices towards open source. And I think what is great about this moment in time for the advancement of the field of HR is that we're seeing more and more resources like this come into the market. So the barriers to be able to access helpful resources and information across a range of topics is less and less. So I think I applaud any types of open source projects like this that I see released. And Dianna, I want to come back to you with kind of the last question. As you think about the key takeaways, and again, I'll include a link to the full toolkit in the show notes. But what do you hope are the key takeaways? Like, when you envision this kind of, being broadly consumed in the marketplace, so to speak, what do you hope are the, two, three, four key things that people take away from using the toolkit?
I think that a key takeaway is that this work is for everybody. So, regardless of whether you're in human resources or you have elsewhere in the organization, or you're in human resources and you want to share it with others, it's for everyone. It's personal. It involves both the head and the heart. And to be truly successful and make the difference in your organization, you need both. I urge and urge folks to embrace that part of the learning. And of course, you need to adapt it to your own context when doing so. There's both people work and systems work to it. And then finally, like anything in life worth pursuing, it takes practice and failure and learning and sharing and innovating. And that's why it's such an important decision for us to make it open source so that we can continue to learn and grow.
Yeah. Well, Debbie, last question to you. And the important question, where can listeners find the toolkit? You mentioned the download. Where can they access it beyond the show notes of the episode?
Yeah, multiple ways. So they can visit the wkkf.org and look under our resources. Our Every Child Thrives site also has the toolkit, and our expandingequity.com website, which is a initiative of the foundation where we've worked with 100 for-profit companies in 10 different industries who are trying to transform their organizations into more equitable workplaces. And they can also find it on that expandingequity.com website. So multiple ways to access it.
Multiple ways. Okay. Well, I'm glad it's accessible. I will help shine the light on those destinations, and I will host it in a few open source resources as well. So Dianna, Debbie, thanks so much for making the time to come on the podcast, share your work, give us an inside look at the HR Toolkit for Racial Equity. And again, just hat tip to both of you for making this open source and an open resource available for all of us to benefit and learn from.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to share.